On the night of August 21st, 1955, a quiet farmhouse in rural Kentucky became the site of one of the strangest and most terrifying encounters in UFO history. For hours, the Sutton family fought against small, goblin-like creatures that seemed impervious to bullets, unafraid of men, and completely inhuman. The story sounds like something from a horror movie, but it was real. What really happened that night? And were these creatures truly from another world? For the Sutton family, life in rural Kentucky was quiet, simple, and uneventful. Their home sat on the outskirts of Kelly, a small, unremarkable community near the town of Hopkinsville. The landscape was vast and isolated, rolling farmland, dense woodlands, and miles of open sky. The kind of place where neighbors lived far apart, where the nights were pitch black, and where strange things could happen without anyone noticing. The Suttons weren't the kind of people to believe in ghosts, aliens, or supernatural nonsense, but on the night of August 21st, 1955, their lives changed forever. That night, 11 people were at the farmhouse. The head of the household was Elmer "Lucky" Sutton, a tough and practical man in his early 20s. He lived there with his wife, Vera, and their young children. Also in the house were Lucky's mother, brothers, and sisters, along with their friends, the Taylors, a visiting couple who had come for a short stay. The most important guest that night was Billy Ray Taylor, a lively and talkative man who had been helping around the farm. He and his wife, June Taylor, had come from Pennsylvania, and Billy Ray was known for his love of wild stories and jokes. The Sutton farmhouse was as isolated as it gets. No phones, no electricity, no running water. Just kerosene lamps, wooden walls, and the endless dark of the Kentucky wilderness. At night, the only light came from the stars and the moon, casting eerie shadows across the fields. The air was thick with summer heat, filled with the sounds of crickets, owls, and the distant rustling of animals in the woods. It was a setting where anything could happen. And on that fateful night, something did. The night began like any other. The family had just finished dinner. The children were playing, the adults were relaxing, and the farm was peacefully silent. Then, Billy Ray stepped outside. He had only planned to fetch some water from the well, but instead, he witnessed something that would terrify him for the rest of his life. A strange, glowing object was descending from the sky. It was metallic, round like a flying saucer, and emitting a faint, eerie glow as it slowly drifted down behind the trees. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the dogs started barking. A feeling of unease crept over the farmhouse. Something was out there. Something was coming. And before the night was over, the Suttons would wish they had never opened the door. Billy Ray Taylor stood frozen, his eyes locked on the glowing object sinking behind the trees. For a few moments, he tried to process what he had just seen. It hadn't moved like an airplane or a shooting star. It floated, controlled, deliberate, unnatural. Then the dogs went wild. A chorus of barks and howls echoed across the property as the farm animals reacted to something unseen. Billy Ray felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. With his heart pounding, he turned and sprinted back to the house. "I just saw a flying saucer." Bursting through the farmhouse door, Billy Ray's face was pale with shock. "I just saw something land out back," he gasped. The others looked up, confused. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lucky Sutton asked. "A flying saucer," Billy Ray insisted. "I swear to God it came down behind the trees." The room fell silent. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the men laughed. "Billy Ray, you've been listening to too many radio shows." They all knew Billy Ray was a talker, a man who loved a good story. They figured he was either playing a joke or exaggerating what he saw. "I ain't lying," Billy Ray shot back. "Something's out there, I swear it." The uneasy energy in the room grew. The dogs outside were still barking, more aggressive now, more frantic. And that's when they heard it. A strange noise coming from the woods, a low metallic hum. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Lucky's expression hardened. "All right," he said, grabbing his shotgun. "Let's go see what's out there." Billy Ray and Lucky stepped outside, their boots crunching on the dirt. The night was still and heavy, the air thick with humidity. The farmhouse's dim kerosene lamps flickered from the windows, casting weak light into the vast darkness beyond. But there was something different about the night now, something watching. As the men made their way toward the tree line, the dogs suddenly stopped barking. Complete silence. Billy Ray and Lucky froze. The sounds of the crickets, the distant croak of frogs, everything had stopped, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Then they saw it. A figure was emerging from the woods. At first it was just a shape, barely visible against the darkness. But as it stepped into the moonlight, both men felt their stomachs drop. It was not human. The creature was small, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, with an oversized head that glowed faintly in the dark. Its eyes were enormous, unblinking, reflective like an animal's in the night. Its long, spindly arms stretched almost to the ground, its fingers thin and claw-like. The most disturbing thing was the way it moved. It didn't walk, it floated. It glided toward them with an eerie smoothness, its feet barely touching the ground. Billy Ray and Lucky stumbled back, gripping their weapons. "What the hell is that?" Lucky whispered. The creature stopped. It was just standing there, watching them. Then, it raised its hands, a gesture of peace, a warning, a sign. Billy Ray didn't wait to find out. He screamed and fired his gun. The blast shattered the silence. But what happened next made their blood run cold. The shot hit the creature square in the chest, yet it didn't fall. Instead, the bullet made a metallic clang, as if it had hit solid metal. The creature flipped backward from the force of impact, but landed without a sound, completely unharmed. Billy Ray and Lucky stared in horror. Then from the darkness they saw more of them. Beyond the first creature, more figures began to appear from the tree line, glowing eyes blinking in the night. They were surrounded. Billy Ray grabbed Lucky's arm. "Run!" Both men turned and sprinted back toward the farmhouse, their lungs burning as they heard the creatures following. They could hear strange rustling noises, metallic scraping, and what sounded like quiet, high-pitched chattering. Whatever these things were, they were coming. Billy Ray and Lucky burst through the door, locking it behind them. "Get the guns!" Lucky yelled. The others jumped to their feet, confused and terrified, as Billy Ray scrambled to grab more weapons. "They're out there!" Billy Ray panted. "A whole bunch of them!" Lucky grabbed more ammunition. "We're not waiting around." With shaking hands, they turned off the lights and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a claw-like hand appeared at the window, scratching, and the real terror began. The Sutton farmhouse had never been so quiet. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the family, the metallic click of guns being loaded, and the faint rustling just outside the house. Something was out there. And then, a sharp scratching noise came from the window. Vera Sutton let out a choked gasp, her hands covering her mouth. Lucky spun toward the noise, shotgun raised. Billy Ray stood beside him, his knuckles white from gripping his weapon. The scratching sound was slow and deliberate, like something testing the glass. Then, a hand appeared. A long, clawed, spindly hand pressed against the window pane, its fingers tapping the glass. The entire room froze. In the dim light of the kerosene lamps, they could see it. A face. Huge, unblinking silver eyes stared into the house. Its head was oversized and bulbous, its skin shimmering, almost metallic. The creature's mouth was small, barely more than a slit. Its ears were large and pointed, standing out like bat wings. It tilted its head, observing them, and then, in a single swift motion, it ducked down, disappearing from view. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a loud thud against the roof. Something had landed on top of the house. A second later, another heavy thump. They weren't just outside, they were above. The children began crying. The women huddled together, whispering prayers. Lucky stepped forward, aiming his shotgun toward the ceiling. Billy Ray rushed to the front door, gripping the handle. "We have to see how many there are," he whispered. Lucky hesitated. Then with a sharp nod, he raised his gun. Billy Ray flung the door open. The porch was empty. For a split second, there was nothing but the stillness of the summer night. Then, a creature lunged from the roof. It dropped right in front of Billy Ray, its arms spread wide, its glowing eyes locked onto his. Billy Ray screamed and fired his gun. The blast hit the creature square in the chest. It flipped backward, but instead of collapsing, it floated weightlessly to the ground, landing with an eerie, graceful motion. The thing was completely unharmed. Billy Ray stumbled back, his mind racing. It didn't do nothing. Lucky stepped forward, his gun already aimed. He fired point blank at the creature. Another metallic clang. The thing fell again, tumbled, then effortlessly righted itself. It was like the bullets weren't even touching them. Then more movement. From the tree line, 3 more creatures emerged, stepping into the moonlight. Another one appeared from behind the barn, and then a clawed hand reached down from the roof. They were everywhere. Billy Ray yelled and slammed the door shut. "We gotta kill the lights!" Lucky shouted. They quickly blew out the kerosene lamps, plunging the house into near total darkness. Outside, the rustling noises grew louder. The creatures were circling the house. For the next several hours, the Suttons and Taylors endured a night of sheer terror. The creatures didn't break down the door. They didn't force their way in. Instead, they toyed with them. They scratched at the walls. They clawed at the windows. They thumped across the roof. Every so often, one of them would peer into a window, those huge silver eyes gleaming in the dark. Lucky fired through the walls, hoping to scare them off. Billy Ray shot at any movement, but it didn't matter. The creatures would fall back when shot, only to return minutes later. They seemed to be playing with them, testing them. And worst of all, they never made a single sound. Not once did they speak, scream, or cry out in pain. They were silent, emotionless, and unstoppable. The family was trapped. The creatures were too fast, too resistant to bullets, too intelligent to walk into a direct attack. The children were hiding under furniture, sobbing into their hands. The adults stood at the windows and doors, guns in hand, waiting for the next shadow to appear. And so the standoff continued. For hours, the creatures kept up their slow, methodical assault, but they never entered. It was as if they were studying the humans, watching, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noises stopped. The scratching, the footsteps, the rustling in the trees. Everything was silent. Lucky squinted out the window, his shotgun still raised. The yard was empty. The creatures had vanished. For the first time in hours, the Suttons could breathe, but none of them felt safe. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they knew they had to get out of there. This was far from over. They needed help, and they needed it now. The Sutton family sat in the pitch-black farmhouse, their guns gripped tightly, waiting for the next attack. For hours, the creatures had scratched at the walls, peered through the windows, and walked across the roof, their metallic skin glinting in the moonlight. But now, they were gone, or so it seemed. Lucky motioned for silence, his ears straining. Outside, the crickets had returned, the distant hoot of an owl breaking the eerie quiet. Had the creatures finally left, or were they waiting for them to make a mistake? Billy Ray's hands trembled as he reloaded his shotgun. He hadn't fired a shot in over an hour, but the memory of the bullets bouncing off those creatures like metal plates haunted him. They had never seen anything like this before, and deep down they all feared they never would again, because no one was supposed to survive something like this. "We have to get out of here." Lucky turned to his family. "We need to leave." Vera clutched his arm. "And go where? They're out there." "We can't just sit here all night," he hissed. "We're going to Hopkinsville. We're getting the police." No one argued. They knew this wasn't just paranoia, it was life or death. But just as they were about to move, a thump from the roof, then another one. The creatures were back, and they weren't done. Billy Ray felt something cold grip his stomach. He stepped toward the front door, shotgun aimed, his pulse pounding in his ears. Lucky moved with him, their backs pressed against the wooden walls. The scratching began again, only this time it was louder, more desperate, and then the window shattered. Vera screamed as a clawed hand reached inside, its long fingers grasping blindly. Lucky fired point blank at the arm. The blast sent the creature flying backward, but again, it was unharmed. The window was broken, glass littering the floor. They couldn't stay here. "Go!" Lucky shouted. "Get to the truck!" The door burst open and they ran. The night air hit them like a wall, the warm humidity clinging to their skin. The yard was pitch black, the only light coming from the distant glow of Hopkinsville, miles away. And then, from the trees, the creatures moved. Dozens of silver eyes blinked in the dark. Billy Ray fired blindly, emptying his shotgun into the night. The bullets hit their targets, sending the creatures flipping, rolling, but just as before, they never fell. Lucky yanked open the truck door. "Get in!" he screamed. The family piled in, their hands shaking so violently they could barely shut the doors. Lucky jammed the keys into the ignition. The truck roared to life. As the vehicle sped away from the farm, kicking up clouds of dust, Vera looked out the back window. The creatures were standing in the road, watching, not chasing, just watching, like they knew something the Suttons didn't. The Suttons and Taylors didn't stop driving until they reached the Hopkinsville police station. They stumbled inside, frantic, babbling over each other about the goblins, the attack, the bullets, the glowing eyes. At first, the officers didn't know what to make of them. But then, they looked closer. The family was pale, shaking, covered in sweat. They had the look of people who had just survived something unspeakable, and that was enough for the police to act. Within the hour, a full team of officers, along with, were heading toward the farmhouse. By the time they arrived, it was nearly 3 a.m. The property was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant chirping of crickets and the low hum of the truck's engine cooling in the summer air. Officers fanned out, sweeping the yard with their flashlights. They were expecting bullet holes, signs of struggle, anything, and they found plenty. The Suttons hadn't been lying about shooting. The ground was littered with spent shotgun shells and .22 caliber casings. At least 2 windows had been shattered from gunfire inside the house. Officers noted a strange, shimmering film on the screen door where Lucky had fired his first shot. It was oily, almost glowing under the flashlight. Near the tree line, there were patches of ground that looked burned. But the most disturbing discovery was what they didn't find. There were no bodies, no footprints, no blood, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. Where did they go? The officers turned back to Lucky. "Where are they now?" one asked. Lucky shook his head. "We don't know." The police searched the entire property. They combed through the fields, the barn, the house. Nothing. Whatever had been there was gone. Or worse, it was still watching. After nearly 2 hours of searching, the police found no creatures, no ship, no hard proof. The officers were baffled. Some suggested owls. Others thought maybe it was a prank gone too far. But one thing was certain. The Suttons were terrified beyond reason. "We ain't staying," Vera finally said. Even after the police assured them the creatures were gone, they refused to return to the farmhouse. Instead, they piled back into their truck and drove to a relative's house in Hopkinsville, determined to wait until morning. They thought the nightmare was finally over, but they were wrong, because just before dawn, back at the empty farmhouse, the creatures came back. By the time the police left, the Sutton farmhouse was completely still. The family had refused to return, choosing instead to spend the night at a relative's house in Hopkinsville. No one spoke much on the drive into town. They were too shaken, too exhausted, too afraid that if they so much as glanced over their shoulders, they might see those glowing silver eyes, watching from the tree line. The adults huddled in the front of the truck, gripping their shotguns, while the children lay curled up in the back seat, still trembling. The nightmare had lasted for hours, but in their minds, it wasn't over. Even now, miles away from the farm, they still felt it lurking, waiting. They told themselves they had escaped, but they hadn't. Because just before dawn, as the first hints of morning light crept over the horizon, the creatures returned. The farmhouse stood empty, silent, abandoned. The police had left, the family had fled, and for the first time all night there were no gunshots, no screams, no frantic movements inside. And yet, something moved in the darkness. In the shadows of the barn, near the tree line, and along the edge of the house, small shapes began to emerge. The creatures had waited. Now, with no humans inside, they approached the house again. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if studying the structure, searching for something left unfinished. Their silver eyes gleamed in the pale light of early dawn. Their bizarre, weightless movements carried them up onto the roof, where their clawed hands once again tapped against the shingles. There were no bullets this time, no men screaming, no desperate fight to keep them out. But they had returned and they were looking for something. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was something more. And then, just as mysteriously as before, they were gone. By the time the sun had fully risen, the farm was just as empty as when the police had last seen it. There were no tracks, no lingering signs of the strange visitors from the night before. It was as if the creatures had simply faded into the morning air. But they had been there, and the Suttons knew it. When Lucky Sutton and the others finally returned to the farm that morning, they hesitated before stepping out of the truck. The house was exactly as they had left it, windows shattered, bullet holes in the walls, the remains of kerosene lamps knocked over and broken. But something about it felt different. The silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty home. It was too heavy, too unnatural. Lucky stepped onto the porch first, gripping his shotgun like a lifeline. The others followed cautiously, eyes darting toward the trees, scanning for any sign of movement, any hint of silver reflecting in the light. Nothing. Billy Ray crept toward the barn, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He peered inside, half expecting to see those monstrous eyes staring back at him from the darkness. But the barn was empty, just as they had left it. Everything was still, and yet, the family could feel it in their bones. Something had been here, something not human. They gathered their belongings as quickly as possible, stuffing bags with whatever they could carry. None of them wanted to spend another night on this land. Whatever had happened here, it was something they would never be able to explain, and it was something they would never forget. News of the encounter spread like wildfire. By the afternoon, reporters, UFO investigators, and curious townsfolk were already swarming the property, desperate for a glimpse of the so-called Hopkinsville Goblins. The Suttons barely had time to process what had happened before they were bombarded with questions. What did they look like? Did you see a spaceship? Do you think they'll come back? The family repeated their story over and over, their exhaustion evident in every word. The descriptions never changed. They never contradicted themselves. Every witness, adults and children alike, told the exact same account, and yet many refused to believe them. Some skeptics claimed the family had been drunk, despite multiple officers confirming that not a single person had appeared intoxicated. Others said it was just a prank, a tall tale blown out of proportion. People insisted the Suttons had simply been attacked by a group of aggressive great-horned owls. The reasoning behind this theory was that great horned owls have large glowing eyes, pointed ears, and silent flight. They are territorial and can sometimes act aggressively when startled. But there were problems with this explanation. First, the Suttons weren't idiots. They were lifelong farmers who knew the difference between an owl and an alien-looking creature. They had spent their lives in the countryside, surrounded by wildlife. If anyone would recognize an owl, it was them. Second, owls do not get up after being shot point blank with a shotgun. The Suttons had fired dozens of rounds at these things. They had heard the metallic clang of bullets hitting them. And most of all, owls don't scratch at windows. They don't march across rooftops. And they don't work in coordinated groups to terrorize a house for hours. Still, the skeptics persisted. The case was written off by many as a hoax or a misidentification. But the Suttons never changed their story. Until the day they died, they swore that what they saw was real. As the years passed, the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter became one of the most infamous UFO cases in history. It inspired movies, TV shows, and countless theories about what really happened that night. Even today, ufologists and skeptics alike still debate whether this was one of the most credible alien encounters ever recorded, or just a strange case of mass hysteria. But those who knew the Suttons personally never doubted them. Because something did happen on that farm, something science has never been able to explain. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the last time these creatures paid Earth a visit. The Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter remains one of the most terrifying and baffling cases in UFO history. It wasn't just one person claiming to see something, it was 11. It wasn't just a fleeting sighting, it was a night-long siege. The Sutton family had nothing to gain from making up this story. They were ridiculed, dismissed, and hounded by the press. They refused book deals, turned away reporters, and did their best to distance themselves from the event. And yet, they never changed their story. Whether the creatures were extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something else entirely, the truth remains. Something visited that farmhouse on the night of August 21st, 1955. And after all these years, no one has ever been able to prove what it really was. Perhaps the most chilling thought of all isn't what happened that night, but the possibility that it could happen again.